Have you ever imagined sleeping peacefully in your own home and waking up in handcuffs, accused of a crime you didn't even know had happened? A brutal crime, committed while you were dreaming, and suddenly everyone looks at you like a monster. The police won't listen to you. The justice system has already condemned you before the trial even begins. And worst of all, you have no way to prove you were sleeping. It's your word against a system that needs to find a culprit at any cost. This isn't some absurd theory or an isolated case. This happened. And the question that no one seems able to answer is, how can a man be convicted without concrete evidence, without direct witnesses, without any real connection to the crime? How can justice fail so grotesquely and simply move on, ignoring the destroyed life left behind? You might think this could never happen to you, that innocent people aren't condemned like this, but reality is far more terrifying than it seems. The truth is, we are all just one step away from living this nightmare. A small coincidence, a mistake in the investigation, a rush to close the case, and that's it. Your face is on the news, your name becomes synonymous with guilt, your friends disappear, your family falls apart. And before you even realize it, your freedom has been stripped away, and no one cares whether you actually did something wrong. The public wants revenge, not justice. But what really happened that night? How was an innocent man dragged into a hell from which escape seemed impossible? And more importantly, who was the real culprit, and why did they manage to stay free for so long? This story is a harsh reality check. Proof of how irreversibly justice can fail. Get ready, because the details of this case will enrage you. Now stop and think, how do you prove your innocence when the only evidence against you is the fact that you were sleeping? If this outrages you as much as it does me, leave a like now so this story can reach more people. And if you believe that no one should be convicted without evidence, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Because believe me, what comes next is even more unbelievable. It was a silent night until a scream shattered the neighborhood's peace. A brutal crime had just taken place. A woman was found lifeless inside her own home, with no signs of forced entry, no witnesses, no clear clues as to who could have done it. The shock spread quickly. Fear took over the community. Who could have committed such brutality without anyone noticing? The police arrived at the scene and, under immense pressure to find a culprit, had to act fast. The media was already speculating, neighbors were whispering, and the entire city demanded answers. Collective fear soon turned into outrage. They wanted justice, but did they really want the truth? That's when one seemingly insignificant detail changed everything. A neighbor, when questioned, mentioned a name. He said the victim knew a man who lived just a few blocks away. He had no criminal record, no disputes with the victim, but there was something the police found suspicious. He lived alone, and that night, he had been sleeping at home with no one to confirm it. For the investigators, that was enough. No alibi, no witnesses to prove where he was. He quickly went from an ordinary citizen to the prime suspect. The police needed to present a culprit to the public as soon as possible, and at that moment, any doubt became a minor issue compared to the urgency of closing the case. His face soon appeared in newspapers and on TV. The media didn't question, they simply reported. His name spread like that of a cruel murderer, a monster who could be living right next door. The neighbors who once greeted him on the street now looked at him with disdain. Friends drifted away. Public opinion had already decided he was guilty. And how do you prove your innocence when no one wants to listen? How do you convince the world that, while the crime was happening, you were asleep? With each passing day, his situation became more desperate. His name was repeated in news reports. Sensationalist headlines linked him to the crime. No one mentioned that there was no solid evidence, that everything was based on fragile assumptions. But the truth is, once a name is chosen to bear the blame, any small detail becomes a conviction. And have you ever imagined being convicted just because no one could prove where you were? Is this justice or just a convenient mistake? Comment below, evidence before guilt, and tell me, should justice seek the truth or simply find a culprit? The pressure to solve the case grew by the minute. The media had turned the crime into a spectacle, and the police needed to deliver a quick response. His name was already circulating as the main suspect, and that was enough for investigators to pursue only one goal: proving he was guilty rather than searching for the truth. The rush to close the case and calm public opinion turned every inconsistency in the investigation into just another overlooked detail. The first piece they tried to fit into the puzzle was an alleged piece of evidence found near the crime scene, an object with partial fingerprints, something that could have belonged to anyone. Even without scientific confirmation, a narrative quickly emerged, claiming it was enough to link him to the crime. But did this really prove anything? An object out of place could be a coincidence. It could have been planted, it could have passed through multiple hands before ending up there. However, when a suspect is already chosen, any doubt becomes a convenient certainty. And then came the witness. A vague, imprecise statement, but in the right circumstances, it was all the prosecution needed. Someone claimed to have seen a person similar to him walking near the victim's house that night. But this resemblance was nothing more than a generic description, something that could have matched dozens of people in the same area. No specific details, no distinctive features, no real evidence. Just the word of someone who, perhaps unknowingly, was helping to condemn an innocent man. But the worst was yet to come. The lack of a solid alibi became the strongest weapon against him. The argument used against the protagonist was as absurd as it was terrifying. He couldn't prove where he was at the time of the crime because he was sleeping. How could anyone have an alibi while sleeping alone in their home? The absence of proof of his innocence was used as proof of his guilt. It was the kind of reasoning that could turn anyone into a suspect. After all, who doesn't sleep alone at some point? If this logic were applied to anyone else, how many innocent people would be dragged into baseless investigations? The most infuriating part was that the police ignored everything that didn't reinforce their theory of guilt. No other line of investigation was seriously considered. Any detail that he pointed in another direction was discarded. The goal wasn't to uncover the truth, but to close the case as quickly as possible. Public opinion was already convinced. The media had its villain, and justice, well, justice seemed to be the least important thing. How many times has justice chosen speed over truth? Is the rush to provide an answer more important than conducting a proper investigation? Tell me in the comments. Should justice seek the truth or just find a culprit? The courtroom was packed. Reporters, onlookers, neighbors, and even people who had never heard of the case before were now there, eagerly waiting for the moment when the accused's fate would be sealed. The trial wasn't just about a crime, it was a spectacle. The public had already reached its verdict before the judge had even begun the session. To them, he was guilty, and if the majority believed it, then it had to be true, right? The prosecutor started his argument with force, exploiting every detail that could reinforce the idea that the man before him was responsible for the crime. He had no alibi. He lived near the crime scene. A witness had seen him in the area. But the most dangerous part of the prosecution wasn't the evidence, because in reality, there was no concrete evidence. What existed was a carefully crafted narrative to make everything seem like it fit together. The prosecutor knew exactly which words to use, which details to emphasize, and which to omit. And the jury, made up of ordinary citizens, was already being influenced before even hearing the other side. The defense tried to fight back. The lawyer made it clear that there wasn't a single piece of physical evidence linking his client to the crime. No fingerprints, no witness placing him inside the victim's house, no plausible motive. But was that enough to convince a jury that had already been poisoned by the media's judgment? The lawyer insisted, "Are we here to convict a man or to find the truth. But did anyone still care about the truth? The key witness was called, the same person who had claimed to have seen someone similar to the defendant near the crime scene. But now, in court, their uncertainty became evident. They hesitated, changed details of their testimony, and couldn't state with absolute certainty that it was really the accused. But even so, the damage was already done. The jury didn't need certainty, only a well-woven thread of doubt to justify a conviction. The defendant sat in silence, watching everything unfold. His gaze was lost, his expression that of someone who already understood what was about to happen. He tried to remain calm, but inside he knew his life was being destroyed in real time. His family, seated right behind him, held back tears. The despair on his mother's face, the fixed stare of his father, the muffled sobs of a sister who couldn't believe what she was witnessing. They knew that no matter what they said, in that courtroom, at that moment, the truth no longer mattered more than the need to convict someone. When the judge called for silence and the jury returned from deliberation, time seemed to stop. The silence was absolute. The defendant took a deep breath, trying to find the strength to hear what he already knew was coming. "Guilty!" The word echoed through the room like a death sentence. His body felt heavy, his legs trembled, but he didn't react. The world around him seemed to collapse. His family screamed in despair. His mother fell to her knees. His sister sobbed uncontrollably. But to the jury, to the prosecutor, to the police, and to public opinion, this was just another case closed. The moment the word guilty was spoken, his world crumbled. The judge's voice seemed distant, muffled by the sheer panic consuming his mind. His family's cries echoed in the courtroom, but to the system, he was now just another number, a closed case, a filed dossier. Handcuffed and escorted away, he was taken without a chance to say goodbye, without time to comprehend that, from that moment on, his life no longer belonged to him. The journey to prison was long, but not as long as the years that lay ahead. As he passed through the rusted iron gates, he felt the weight of what was to come. The narrow cells, the damp hallways, the constant echo of footsteps on concrete, the smell of despair mixed with fear. He didn't belong in this place, but here he was, not knowing when or if he would ever leave. The first night was a nightmare. The thin mattress, the cold walls, the screams coming from other cells. The silence when it came was worse than the noise. He tried to sleep, but how could he rest knowing he was surrounded by real criminals, men who had committed heinous crimes, who carried in their eyes the complete loss of hope? Here, it didn't matter if you were innocent or guilty. The only thing that mattered was whether you were strong enough to survive. The first few months were the cruelest. Violence was constant, not just physical but psychological. The humiliation of being treated like garbage, of being called by a number instead of a name. The guards looked at him with contempt. To them, everyone here was guilty. It didn't matter what his story was. It didn't matter what the evidence said or didn't say. He was just another convict. In the cafeteria, the food was cold, tasteless. Conversations were full of threats, and one wrong move could be costly. Inside his cell, he spent hours staring at the ceiling, trying to understand how this had happened. How had justice failed so grotesquely? How had no one realized he didn't belong here? But the worst part was knowing that time didn't stop. The world outside kept moving while he rotted between four walls. But he refused to accept that this would be his fate. Every day when he woke up, he repeated to himself, "I am innocent." He began writing letters to lawyers, to human rights organizations, to anyone who might listen to his story. Some were never answered. Others came back with a standard response: "Unfortunately, we cannot help." But he didn't give up, because giving up meant accepting injustice. Time passed, and he realized he needed more than words. He needed proof. He needed someone to believe in him, someone willing to reopen his case. Each passing day was one less day to reclaim his life. But the question was, would anyone, anywhere, be willing to listen before it was too late? The years dragged on, each day swallowed by the relentless monotony of prison. But he never stopped fighting. Every letter sent, every ignored plea, every look of disdain from the guards only reinforced his determination. He knew the truth was out there, buried under the weight of haste, negligence, and the system's need to find a culprit. And then, one day, something changed. A letter arrived in his cell, different from the others. The envelope was simple, with no official markings, but the sender's name made his heart race. It was from an organization that reviewed wrongful conviction. They had received one of his letters, briefly analyzed his case, and found something that caught their attention. The trial was full of inconsistencies, vague testimonies, a lack of concrete evidence, an investigation that had ignored other suspects. Something was very wrong. For the first time in years, he felt that someone was willing to listen. The organization began reviewing the case files, and the glaring flaws quickly became apparent. The lack of physical evidence, the witness who was never sure they had actually seen him, the way the police ignored other possible suspects, focusing solely on him. And then came the biggest discovery. Within the case files, there was a forensic report from the time of the investigation mentioning the presence of biological material at the crime scene. A genetic trace had been collected and archived, but never properly analyzed. With advances in technology, a more precise DNA test was now possible. The organization filed a request to have the sample tested again. The justice system resisted. The prosecution pushed back, but pressure from the media and public opinion began to grow. Social media started questioning the conviction, and the case, once forgotten, began gaining traction. Society wanted answers. What if he really was innocent? The test was conducted. Days of agonizing waiting followed, until finally, the results arrived. The DNA found at the crime scene did not belong to him. The official document confirming this hit the system like an explosion. The truth, ignored for years, was now undeniable. He was not the murderer. He should never have been convicted. But the most shocking revelation was yet to come. When they compared the sample with the criminal database, a match surfaced. The real culprit had been there the entire time. It was someone close to the victim, someone who, somehow, had escaped suspicion while the system fixated solely on the protagonist. The revelation sent shockwaves through the case, and the very prosecutor who had once led the charge against him was forced to admit that a catastrophic mistake had been made. The news reached him inside the prison. After years of fighting, years of being treated like a criminal, there was finally irrefutable proof of his innocence. But how does someone feel after losing so much time, so many moments, so many chances, all because of a mistake that should never have happened? He was closer to freedom than ever before, but there was still one final battle to fight. How many years of your life would you be willing to lose for a mistake made by the justice system? Imagine waking up one day to realize that your freedom has been stolen, that your name has been permanently stained, that everything you built has simply vanished. Now think about this. How many people are living this exact nightmare right now? How many innocent people remain behind bars, forgotten, convicted not by evidence but by haste, neglect, and a flawed system that prefers to close cases rather than ensure the truth is found? This story is not an isolated case. Mistakes like this happen every single day. And the worst part? Many of these innocent people never get the chance to prove their truth. Justice comes too late, when they've already lost everything, when their lives have already been destroyed. How many more have to suffer before something changes? What would you do if it happened to you or someone you love? If this story outraged you, imagine how many innocent people are still living this nightmare right now. at this very moment. Leave a like and share this video now, because the more people know about this, the lower the chances of it happening again. And if you want to keep uncovering the most unbelievable cases of injustice, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, because in the next video, you're going to see something so shocking, it will change the way you see the justice system forever.